There is a gate at the heart of the Imperial Palace on Terra. It is called the Eternity Gate, and it is the last door between the Emperor's golden throne and everything else in the universe. No enemy has ever passed through it, no assassin, no daimon, no traitor, no Primarch turned to darkness. For 10,000 years, that gate has remained inviolate, and the reason it has never been breached is not because the door itself is strong, though it is, forged from the most durable materials the Imperium could devise. The reason is what stands in front of it: golden figures in armor that gleams like captured sunlight, figures that stand taller than any space marine you have ever imagined, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that seems almost wrong for being so large. Each one holds a weapon that combines a bolter and a power blade into something the lore calls a guardian spear, though the word spear barely captures what it actually is. Each one has been alive for centuries, perhaps longer. Each one has been personally crafted, not trained, not modified, but crafted by the greatest genetic mind in human history. Each one is a walking argument that there may, in fact, be such a thing as perfection. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's shield made flesh and oromite, and today we are going to spend a long, careful, deeply satisfying amount of time asking a single question. Just how powerful are they really? Because the surface-level answer, that they are very powerful, doesn't quite get at the thing. It's like looking at the ocean and saying, it's quite wet. Technically accurate, leaves a lot out. The Custodes occupy a specific place in the Warhammer 40,000 setting that is genuinely difficult to articulate without understanding their history, their creation, their purpose, and the 1,000 different ways the lore has tried to communicate just how far above ordinary warriors these beings actually are. They are not Space Marines. They are not even like Space Marines. They exist in a different category entirely, and the gap between a Space Marine and a Custodian is arguably as large as the gap between a regular human soldier and a Space Marine. So, settle in, get comfortable. This is the kind of story that deserves to be told slowly, from the very beginning, with enough time given to each piece that, at the end, you feel the full weight of what the Golden Warriors of Terra actually represent. We are going to go from the very first days of the Emperor's rise to power on a shattered Terra, through the Great Crusade and the worst catastrophe in human history, through 10,000 years of silent vigilance, and all the way to the current state of the Imperium in the 42nd millennium. By the end, the question will have an answer, but the answer will mean something different than it did at the start. Part 1. The Golden Few. Who are the Custodians? Long before the Imperium of Man existed as anyone would recognize it today, long before the Space Marine legions marched out across the stars, long before the Primarchs were scattered to the winds and found, and long before the Great Crusade set out to reclaim the galaxy from the dark, there were the Custodians. Their existence predates almost everything. When the Emperor first emerged from the centuries of hidden labor that had been his life on ancient Terra, when he first began the long and brutal work of unifying a world that had torn itself apart over millennia of war and catastrophe, there were already figures at his side. Giants of crimson and gold, the oldest records call them. Beings who stood head and shoulders above ordinary humans, who moved through the chaos of battle with a stillness that bordered on eerie, who seemed to anticipate threats before those threats had fully formed. They were there when the Emperor demanded the surrender of tyrant warlords. They were there when negotiations failed and blades had to speak instead. They were there at the beginning of everything, and they have been at the heart of everything ever since. What makes them remarkable, even against the backdrop of the Warhammer 40,000 setting, where remarkable things are almost mundane, is the philosophy behind their creation. The Emperor did not make the Custodians the way he made his other warriors. He did not want soldiers in bulk, a repeatable process, a production line. He wanted something else entirely. He wanted guardians. And to make a true guardian, he believed, you could not use a template. You could not stamp them out like coins from a die. Each one had to be made the way you make something precious, individually, carefully, with complete attention paid to every detail of that specific person. The official lore describes the process of creating a custodian as closer to crafting a work of art than to manufacturing a weapon. Where a Space Marine is produced through a reasonably standardized procedure, implanting gene seed organs into adolescent humans who have been selected for compatibility, the custodian creation process begins in infancy. Selected children, barely old enough to understand what is being done to them, are subjected to a process of cellular alchemy so complex that it has been compared to rewriting the fundamental code of what a human being is. The Emperor, drawing on accumulated genetic lore from the dark age of technology, from sources that most of the Imperium has forgotten even existed, takes the raw material of human potential and elevates it into something that barely qualifies as human anymore. This process cannot be rushed. It cannot be shortcut. It cannot be handed off to a mechanicum production facility and scaled up to meet demand. The knowledge required to do it exists in only one mind, and that mind sat on the Golden Throne 10,000 years ago and has not spoken a coherent word since. Every custodian alive in the 41st millennium is therefore one of a fixed and irreplaceable resource. When they die, they are not replaced by a new custodian. They are replaced by a wound in the Emperor's guard that may never fully heal. This is why there are only around 10,000 of them, give or take, across the entire history of the Imperium. Not 10,000 per chapter, not 10,000 on each front line, yet 1,000 total, for the protection of all Terra, all the Imperial Palace, all the Golden Throne itself. And in the modern era, any critical mission the Captain General deems worthy of deploying them. 10,000 warriors to stand between humanity and the abyss. 10,000, and each one worth more than most armies. They do not have the genetic diversity of the Space Marines, with their hundreds of different chapters each bearing the gene seed of a different Primarch. The Custodians have one genetic source, and it is not a Primarch. Their template comes from the Emperor himself, not in the way that Space Marines draw their genetic heritage indirectly from the Primarchs, who in turn were designed using the Emperor's own DNA as a base template. The Custodians are closer than that, much closer. The cellular alchemy that shapes them leaves each one, as the lore puts it, forever touched by a spark of the Emperor's own divinity. That phrase could be dismissed as poetic imperial propaganda if it weren't for what that divinity apparently does in practice. Bullets that should find their mark veer away at the last moment. Blades that were perfectly aimed somehow fail to strike home. Psychic attacks that would flatten a Space Marine into a smoking ruin flicker and die in the presence of the 10,000, as if whatever power the Emperor invested in them acts as a kind of ambient ward, a constant invisible barrier against the workings of fortune gone wrong. The Lexiconum records that some Custodians find that the holy light of the Emperor seems to physically glow around them, a luminescence that blinds enemies and drives them back in what can only be described as terror mixed with awe. Whether you read that as supernatural protection or simply the effect of their overwhelming presence on lesser minds, the result is the same. Custodians are harder to kill than they have any right to be. There is also something worth noting about the psychological effect of the Custodians on anyone who encounters them in person. The accounts that survive in the Black Library's novels describe the experience of standing in the presence of a custodian as profoundly disorienting in a way that goes beyond the simple fact of their physical scale. There is an authority that radiates from them that is not merely the authority of rank or the authority of demonstrated physical superiority. It is something older and stranger, closer to what people in the 41st millennium might describe as the physical manifestation of holiness, a quality that makes ordinary humans want to kneel and makes extraordinary ones want to justify themselves. This quality does not switch off. A custodian standing completely still, doing nothing, making no threat and taking no action, is still the most imposing presence in any room that does not also contain a Primarch or the Emperor himself. They are biologically immortal. Their aging stops somewhere around the equivalent of a human's early 30s, and then it simply does not continue. A veteran shield captain might be well over 1,000 years old and bear no more physical age than a young man. Their organs do not decay. Their cells do not succumb to the slow arithmetic of entropy that claims every mortal life. They can be killed, certainly, and the history of the Custodians is full of names carved into walls of remembrance, but they cannot be worn down by time the way everything else eventually is. Every decade they exist is another decade of experience, another decade of refining the skills that were already extraordinary when they were first created. Their senses are augmented to a degree that makes the legendary perception of a Space Marine seem almost ordinary by comparison. They can hear a whispered conversation across a vast hall. They can track targets by heartbeat, by the subtle change in air pressure caused by a person's movement, by chemical traces so faint that they would be invisible to any other being. The highly sophisticated proximity sensors built into their armor make it essentially impossible to approach one undetected. They know when something is wrong before it goes wrong. They feel threats the way some people feel weather changing. The range and precision of their senses have significant tactical implications that are easy to overlook. A custodian who walks into a room can simultaneously assess every person present for concealed weapons, biological anomalies that might indicate augmentation or corruption, elevated stress responses that suggest deception or hostile intent, and a dozen other data points that ordinary beings are not even equipped to perceive. They can conduct this assessment without any visible indication that they are doing so. They can stand in a crowd at a formal event, apparently relaxed and ceremonial in posture, while their minds have already mapped every exit, identified every potential threat, and calculated the optimal response sequence to 6 different possible attack scenarios. This is not preparation. This is simply how their minds operate continuously. The situation awareness that a highly trained soldier might achieve during a moment of extreme focus is, for a custodian, the default resting state. This means that surprising a custodian is not just difficult. It is, in practice, nearly impossible. The history of assassination attempts against the custodians and against the Emperor under their protection is extensively documented in the classified records they maintain, and the pattern is consistent. The assassin or infiltrator is detected long before they expect to be, often before they have committed any overtly hostile act. The custodians do not wait for a threat to announce itself. They read the geometry of the situation, the weight of intention in the air, the microscopic signals that a trained observer produces before they act, and they respond before the attack begins. And their minds. That is perhaps the most underrated aspect of what the custodians are. They are not just warriors. They are strategists, historians, philosophers, diplomats, and custodians in the literal sense of the Imperium's oldest and most closely guarded knowledge. Their mental conditioning makes them immune to psychic manipulation in ways that even the most disciplined space marine cannot match. Their intellect surpasses ordinary human genius the way a mountain surpasses a hill. They are taught not only to fight, but to think, to speak, to persuade, to understand the political machinery of the Imperium at levels that would confound most high-ranking Imperial officials. A custodian who walks into a room and chooses not to fight is still one of the most formidable presences any human being will ever encounter. They are, as the lore flatly states, in almost every measurable way, superhuman, stronger, faster, more acute of senses, and more resilient than even the Space Marines who came after them, so far beyond the limits of an unaugmented human as to be almost godlike in comparison. Only the Primarchs and, above them, the Emperor himself exceeded the custodians in raw physical might. That is the company they keep. That is the tier they occupy. If you've made it this far, and you're enjoying this journey into the golden heart of the Emperor's most perfect warriors, drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing where this reaches. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good moment. There is a lot more to unpack. Part 2. Before the Imperium, the Unification Wars. To understand the Custodians fully, you have to go back to a time before the Imperium existed. A time before the Great Crusade, before the Space Marine Legions, before any of the grand mythology of Warhammer 40,000 had taken its recognizable shape. You have to go back to a Terra that had spent thousands of years tearing itself apart. The Age of Strife had broken humanity's civilization across the entire galaxy. Warp storms had severed interstellar travel and communication. Worlds that had once been part of a connected civilization suddenly found themselves alone in the dark, cut off from trade, from governance, from the shared infrastructure of knowledge that had kept their populations alive. Some worlds endured. Most descended into varying degrees of barbarism, conflict, and misery. Terra itself, the birth world of humanity, the most populated and arguably most important single planet in the species' history, became a fractured hellscape of warlord kingdoms, techno-barbarian empires, gene cult factions, and feudal states, each fighting the others for supremacy over a dying world. This was the stage onto which the Emperor finally stepped. After centuries of hidden work, hidden preparation, hidden cultivation of the genetic and technological tools he believed would be needed, He emerged from obscurity and began the process of unifying Terra by whatever means necessary. Diplomacy where diplomacy worked, violence where it did not. The early accounts are fragmented and deliberately suppressed in much of the Imperium's official histories. But what survives paints a picture of a campaign that lasted decades and consumed what might have been tens of millions of lives on both sides. The Emperor did not go to war alone. In those earliest campaigns, before the Thunder Warriors had been created in the numbers that would eventually give him the mass military force he needed, before the Proto-Space Marines existed in even experimental form, the Emperor was accompanied by what the records call a few giants in crimson and gold. Even then, even in those prehistoric days of the Imperium, the Custodians existed. In small numbers, perhaps, and probably in an earlier and somewhat less developed form than the 10,000 who would march with the Great Crusade, but they were there. They were always there. Their role in the Unification Wars was multifaceted. They served as the Emperor's personal bodyguard in the most immediate sense, standing between him and any threat that might present itself during the brutal business of planetary conquest. They served as his executioners, dealing with threats that required absolute discretion and complete certainty of outcome. They served as his symbols, walking representations of the Emperor's authority, being so visibly beyond anything ordinary that their presence at a negotiation table said more clearly than any proclamation that the person across from them was dealing with something that had no precedent. And later, when the Unification Wars were drawing toward their conclusion, they served in a darker capacity that speaks to the moral complexity that runs through the entire history of the Custodians. The Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first mass-produced superhuman soldiers, had been instrumental in unifying Terra. They had been built for war in the most direct sense possible, bodies pushed to the absolute limits of what the genetic science of the time could achieve, perhaps slightly beyond those limits. They were enormous, ferocious, terrifyingly effective in battle. They had won the wars their creator needed won, and now they were dying. Their accelerated bodies were breaking down. They were becoming unstable, and some of them had begun to realize the shape of their fate. The story of what happened to the Thunder Warriors is one of the Warhammer 40,000 setting's genuinely disturbing moments, because it involves the Emperor doing something that even his most devoted followers struggle to fully justify. When a faction of Thunder Warriors, under one of their leaders named Ushotin, rose in revolt, it was Constantine Valdor, the greatest of the Custodians and their Captain General, who confronted Ushotin personally. The Thunder Warrior was cut down. And the broader elimination of the Thunder Warriors, those who had served faithfully and those who had not, was carried out substantially by the early Custodians. This was not squeamishness on the Emperor's part about delegating difficult work to Space Marines who had barely begun to exist. The Custodians were chosen for this task because they were the only beings the Emperor trusted completely with the knowledge of what was being done and why. They were the only warriors who could be absolutely certain to carry out the elimination of superhuman soldiers without hesitation or error. And they were the only beings whose loyalty was so thorough, so fundamental to their very nature, that they would not recoil from the act or draw conclusions that might undermine the project going forward. That last point matters enormously. The Custodians were not merely powerful, they were trustworthy in a way that the lore presents as almost qualitatively different from ordinary loyalty. A Space Marine could turn traitor, as the Horus Heresy would prove in the most catastrophic way possible. A Primarch could fall, corrupted or broken or driven mad by forces they did not fully understand. But the Custodians, forged from the Emperor's own genetic material, psycho-indoctrinated from infancy in ways even more profound than those applied to Space Marines. Bound to the Emperor by ties of blood and conditioning and whatever it is that the spark of imperial divinity actually does to a mind, were incorruptible in a way that nothing else in the Imperium could claim. That incorruptibility was not a limitation. It was the point. These were beings who existed to guard the one thing in the Imperium that could not be allowed to fail, the Emperor himself. Every other structure, every legion, every world, every system of governance could theoretically be rebuilt from ruins. The one thing that could not be replaced was the will and the genius and the sheer overwhelming power of the man who had conceived the whole project. The Custodians were the insurance policy against the universe's worst outcomes, and the premium for that insurance was that they had to be, at the deepest possible level, beyond corruption. The Unification Wars ended with Terra unified, and the Custodians having established what would become their fundamental role for the next 30,000 years. They were not an army, they were a guard, the finest guard that had ever existed, composed of individuals who were each worth entire armies, but a guard nonetheless. Their purpose was not conquest, their purpose was protection. And in the years that followed, as the Great Crusade began to take shape and the Space Marine legions were assembled, and the vast machinery of imperial expansion began to turn, the Custodians stepped back from the main stage of galactic history and returned to where they belonged, at the Emperor's side. But to step back from the main stage is not the same as being absent from the events that unfold there. The Custodians were present at the negotiations and the campaigns and the political decisions that shaped the early Imperium in ways that history has largely glossed over, because historians are far more interested in the Primarchs and the legions than in the quiet golden figures who stood behind the Emperor at every significant moment. The Primarchs got the glory and the chronicles. The Custodians got the proximity to power and the knowledge of everything that really happened. Constantine Valdor, in those early years before the heresy, earned his 1,932 names through a combination of military service, diplomatic missions, covert operations, and acts of protection that the official records describe in the most general terms possible, while making clear that each one was significant. He commanded the Custodian contingent on Prospero when Leman Russ led the Space Wolves to destroy Magnus's city. He was present at the highest councils of the Imperium. He watched the seeds of the heresy being planted in decisions made before anyone recognized them as dangerous, and he carried the weight of that foreknowledge with the same stoic precision he brought to everything else. What the early Custodians understood about themselves, and what the Unification Wars had cemented, was that they were not like any other military force the Imperium would ever produce. The Space Marine legions would be humanity's sword, enormous and broad, and capable of striking across the entire galaxy at once. The Custodians were something different, precise, specific. The instrument you used when a sword was too large or too blunt or too likely to do damage you needed to avoid. The Emperor's scalpel, the tool of perfect necessity, deployed only when no lesser instrument would do. During the Great Crusade itself, the Custodians were present at the Emperor's side at the most significant engagements, the ones too important and too dangerous to be trusted entirely to the legions. The Fandom Wiki records the Battle of Gyros Thravian, a campaign in which Custodians fought alongside Space Marine legions against threats that required their specific capabilities. They fought on Ulanor. They were present at the crowning of Horus as War Master, though what any of them made of that ceremony in private is something the lore does not record. Through all of it, they watched, they assessed. They stood at the Emperor's shoulder and saw the shape of the galaxy being made, and they understood in ways that even the Primarchs may not have fully grasped that what was being built was something fragile as well as magnificent. This self-understanding shaped the culture of the Custodians in ways that persist to the 41st millennium. They do not celebrate mass victory. They do not sing songs of conquest. The martial tradition they have built is one of perfection, not scale, of doing exactly what needs to be done and no more, of the absolute minimum of force required to achieve the specific outcome demanded. When a Custodian is given a mission, the expected result is not approximately successful. It is completely successful. Anything less is, by their own standards, a failure. The psychological weight of this standard is something that the Custodians absorb from infancy through their conditioning and training. They are not taught to fear failure in the way that produces paralysis in lesser warriors. They are taught to understand failure as information, as data that tells you exactly what the gap was between your preparation and the reality you encountered, and to close that gap before the next engagement. This is part of what the Blood Games are for. This is part of what the centuries of ongoing training and refinement are about. The Custodians do not rest on what they can do. They continuously expand it. Part 3. The Emperor's Masterwork. How Custodians are made, here, is something that seems simple, but becomes less simple the more you think about it. There are roughly 10,000 Custodians. There are roughly 1 million Space Marines spread across hundreds of chapters. The Space Marines are unambiguously more numerous and represent a far more significant military force in terms of sheer scale. And yet the Custodians are considered, by the lore, to be meaningfully superior to Space Marines at the level of the individual warrior. Why? What actually makes them better? The answer, in its most fundamental form, is the creation process. And to understand the creation process, you have to understand the difference between manufacturing and craftsmanship. A Space Marine is created through a process that, for all its complexity and danger, is essentially replicable. An aspirant is found, usually a young human male between the ages of 10 and 16, though this varies somewhat by chapter. That aspirant is put through a series of tests that are physically and psychologically brutal, not because the chapters enjoy cruelty, but because the gene seed implantation process has a significant failure rate, and the tests weed out candidates who would not survive the procedure. Those who pass are implanted with 19 distinct organs, each one derived from the genetic template of their chapter's Primarch, each one designed to modify a specific aspect of the aspirant's biology. Secondary hearts, multi-lungs that can process toxic atmospheres, reinforced skeleton and musculature, the Becher's gland that allows them to spit highly corrosive poison, the Osman modula that enhances bone density, the catalepsian node that allows them to sleep one hemisphere of their brain at a time. 19 organs, each serving a specific function, together transforming a human being into something that is still recognizably humanoid, but operates on an entirely different physical level. This process takes years. It is not comfortable. A significant number of candidates die during the process or are rendered unsuitable, but it can be done by apothecaries who have been trained in the procedure. It can be replicated with the right gene seed stock. It can produce year after year the steady stream of new warriors that keeps the Space Marine chapters at operational strength. It is, in the most meaningful sense of the word, a system. The custodian creation process is not a system. It is something that, as the Warhammer community's own official lore describes it, required the Emperor's unimaginable intellect and access to accumulated troves of genetomantic knowledge drawn from the most advanced and most dangerous eras of humanity's history. The truth of how it actually works is hidden in sources that are fragmentary, encrypted, classified at levels of imperial secrecy that place them beyond the reach of even senior Mechanicum adepts. There are cave etchings, hieroglyphics, stasis-locked parchments, and gene-sealed tomes that speak of the process, but most of them cannot be opened by any living person. What the lore tells us is that custodian creation begins not with an adolescent, but with an infant. Children who have been identified, through processes that are themselves largely secret, as having the right genetic substrate to survive what comes next. These children are then subjected to something the sources describe as a biochemical process of such intricacy and sophistication that it reshapes not just the body, but something that the lore refers to, somewhat mystically, as the soul. The Custodian Armor Wiki entry describes it as cellular alchemy. The Lexiconum calls it the most rarefied and time-consuming process of gene crafting in the Imperium's history. The Black Library novel, The First Heretic, specifically notes that the process does not shackle the resulting custodians with loyalties outside the Emperor, suggesting that the conditioning goes deeper than any post-creation training could reach. The modifications this process produces go significantly beyond what gene seed implants achieve in Space Marines. A baseline custodian is substantially taller than a Space Marine. The VS Battles Wiki, drawing on lore sources, places the average custodian at around 3 meters tall and approximately 700 kilograms in weight, with exceptional individuals reaching nearly 4 meters and 1,700 kilograms. These figures need to be taken with some flexibility, given the varying nature of 40K's lore, but they communicate the point. A custodian is not just a bigger Space Marine. They are on a fundamentally different physical scale. Their strength exceeds a Space Marine's in every recorded measurement. Their reaction speed is described in the lore as allowing them to move as blurs even to other enhanced beings. Their sensory range is several orders of magnitude beyond what even a Space Marine's enhanced senses can achieve. Their regenerative capabilities surpass those of Astartes significantly. The VS Battles documentation notes that custodians can continue fighting while sustaining injuries that would take a Space Marine out of action permanently, including fighting while missing significant portions of their skull and brain, which places their survival capabilities in a category that borders on biological absurdity by any normal standard. There is also something the lore refers to as a martial trance, an altered state that particularly gifted or veteran custodians can enter during combat, where their already extraordinary capabilities are dramatically multiplied. In this state, their hyper-advanced brains unlock capabilities that they cannot sustain in normal operation. Their reaction times drop to near precognitive levels, and their physical performance reaches peaks that would seem impossible even for what they already are. This is not a common occurrence, and it cannot be maintained indefinitely, but it is one of the reasons that veteran custodians have a reputation in the lore for performing feats in battle that defy straightforward explanation. Then there is the blood games. No discussion of how custodians are made is complete without the blood games, because the creation process only provides the raw material. What the blood games do is something else. The blood games are a tradition of training that has been part of custodian culture since the earliest days of their existence. In their traditional form, they involve a custodian attempting to penetrate the defenses of the imperial palace as if they were an assassin, using whatever means necessary, without the assistance of their armor and weapons and rank. The defenders of the palace, which includes other custodians, do not know when a blood game is in progress or who might be running one. The goal is not to actually breach the final defenses, but to find weaknesses, expose gaps in the security architecture, and push the defenders to identify and close those gaps before an actual enemy can exploit them. Completing a blood game successfully once is considered a significant achievement. There is only one person in all of recorded custodian history who has successfully completed a blood game twice. That person is Trajan Valoris, the current Captain General, and we will talk about him at length later. The point is that the blood games are not just a training exercise. They are a continuous refinement process that has been running for over 10,000 years. Every generation of custodians has participated in them. Every weakness found has been corrected. The result is a force that has spent 10 millennia stress testing itself against the best security minds in the Imperium, and the gaps they find are always closed. The defenses of the Imperial Palace are not merely the physical architecture of walls and gates and weapons platforms. They are the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of enemies trying and failing to find the way in. The custodians are also educated in ways that go far beyond military training. They learn history, philosophy, the arts, the mechanics of imperial governance, the political structures of the various imperial institutions, the nature of the enemies they might face, and the theoretical principles of warfare at levels of sophistication that would serve them in any high command position in the Imperium. They speak multiple languages. They understand the function of every major institution, from the Adeptus Mechanicus to the Inquisition to the Ecclesiarchy. They know, at a level of detail that most Space Marines never achieve, how the Imperium actually works and what it means when something in that machinery starts to fail. This education serves a practical purpose. Custodians are not just warriors. They are the Emperor's eyes in the world, his emissaries, his representatives when he cannot speak for himself. When a custodian walks into a room, they carry the full weight of Imperial authority. They have the power to demand cooperation from any level of Imperial hierarchy, up to and including the High Lords of Terra themselves. They answer to no law except the Emperor's direct authority. For this power to be used wisely rather than destructively, the beings wielding it need to understand, at a deep level, what they are protecting and why. Consider what it means that the custodians are individually lords of the Imperium. This is not an honorific. It is a formal legal and political reality. Each custodian holds a rank in the imperial hierarchy that grants them authority over essentially every other human being they encounter. They can demand resources, cooperation, intelligence, and service from nobles, generals, planetary governors, and senior Mechanicus adepts alike. They can enter restricted areas, access classified information, commandeer transport, and require explanations from anyone in the Imperium's administrative apparatus, from the highest to the lowest. When a custodian demands something, refusal is not a practical option, not because the custodian will necessarily respond with violence, though they certainly can, but because refusing a custodian is, in the logic of the Imperium, refusing the Emperor himself. This political dimension of their power is sometimes overlooked in discussions focused primarily on their combat capability, but it is genuinely significant. In the 41st Millennium's Imperium, where so much depends on navigating a labyrinthine bureaucracy governed by competing institutions, the ability to step outside all of those structures and act on the direct authority of the Golden Throne is extraordinary. The Inquisition has significant autonomous authority, But even Inquisitors operate within legal frameworks and face checks and balances. The Custodians operate above all of that. They are not subject to any court-martial, any imperial tribunal, any form of legal accountability that does not originate from the Emperor's direct authority. In practice, this means they are accountable only to themselves and their own code, which is precisely why the depth of their conditioning matters so completely. You do not give beings this much power without ensuring, as thoroughly as it is possible to ensure anything, that they will use it rightly. The sophistication of their training also manifests in ways directly relevant to combat, but often not recognized as training in the conventional sense. The Custodians study art, not as leisure, but as a discipline teaching spatial awareness, pattern recognition, the ability to hold complex structures in mind and evaluate them for coherence and flaw. They study philosophy not because the Emperor believed warriors should be cultured, though he did, but because philosophical reasoning is the foundation of ethical decision-making under pressure, and the Custodians frequently face situations where no clear rule exists and the correct action must be reasoned out in real time with complete certainty. They study histories in extraordinary depth. Not the official histories of the Imperium, which are extensively edited and often more propaganda than record, but the raw, classified, unedited accounts kept only in the vaults of the palace, the full story of the Unification Wars, the true account of what happened to the Thunder Warriors, the actual records of what went wrong during the Horus Heresy, without the mythologization that has accumulated over 10 millennia of imperial storytelling. The Custodians know what the Imperium really is, with all its compromises and failures and necessary cruelties, and they serve it anyway. That is a different kind of loyalty than the blind devotion that motivates some imperial servants. It is the loyalty of beings who see clearly and choose their duty with full awareness of its costs. Part 4. The Iron and the Gold. Custodes against Space Marines. This is the comparison that everyone wants to make, and the one that generates the most passionate discussion in any corner of the Warhammer community. Space Marines are the iconic super soldiers of Warhammer 40,000. They are the face of the setting. Every new player learns about Space Marines first. They are the standard against which all other warriors in the Imperium are measured. So, when people encounter the Custodians and start to understand what the lore is actually saying about their capabilities, the natural question becomes, how much better are they, exactly? The tabletop game gives us a precise but somewhat limited answer. In the game's mechanical language, a Custodian Guard model has a superior stat line compared to a standard Space Marine across essentially every category that matters: higher weapon skill, higher ballistic skill, greater strength, greater toughness, more wounds, and more attacks. The points cost reflects this. A single Custodian Guard costs significantly more in points than a Space Marine, meaning any Custodes force will be substantially outnumbered against an equivalent Space Marine force in terms of model count. This tabletop dynamic is, relatively unusually for Warhammer, a reasonably faithful reflection of the lore. The numbers are somewhat abstract, and the specific values have changed across editions, but the fundamental truth they encode is consistent. One Custodian is equivalent to several Space Marines in terms of combat effectiveness. The commonly cited figure in community discussions, though it's worth noting this is partly an abstraction, is that a Space Marine is roughly equivalent in combat value to around 20 Guardsmen, which would place a Custodian somewhere in the range of several hundred Guardsmen in comparable terms. Exact numbers in this area should be taken as illustration rather than rigorous calculation, but they give a sense of scale. The lore provides more nuanced and more dramatic evidence. The fandom wiki's description of the Custodians notes explicitly that their capabilities place them so far beyond ordinary humans as to be almost godlike in comparison, and that only the Primarchs and the Emperor himself exceeded them in physical might. This is a significant statement. The Primarchs are beings who could survive being shot by weapons that would kill anything short of a demon, who could engage in hand-to-hand combat with creatures that would annihilate entire squads of Space Marines without breaking stride. If Custodians are below Primarchs but above everything else, that places them in a genuinely extraordinary tier. What does that look like in practice? The lore offers glimpses. Custodians have been shown to fight through wounds that would be immediately fatal to Space Marines. continuing to engage enemies while sustaining damage to their central nervous systems that should have ended any organic being. Their speed in close combat is described repeatedly as something that even other enhanced warriors struggle to track, a fluidity of movement that makes them appear almost prescient in the way they respond to attacks. Their physical strength allows them to fight in ways that the weight and bulk of their armor should theoretically prevent, catching incoming blade strikes with one hand while bringing a weapon to bear with the other, twisting a much larger enemy's attack aside with a precision that suggests they are operating well within their actual physical limits, even in the most extreme circumstances. When you look at the documented encounters between Custodians and Space Marines, the record is fairly clear. In almost every direct engagement between the two, the Custodians come out decisively ahead. The exception that is frequently cited, from the novel The Outcast Dead, is generally considered an aberration even within the fan community that discusses these things, and the broader pattern across dozens of other sources is consistent. Space Marines are elite warriors of extraordinary capability, and Custodians are in a different category. One useful way to think about the difference is through the creation philosophy discussed in the previous section. Space Marines are, at their core, a product of standardization. The gene seed process produces warriors who are extraordinary, but who also share known, cataloged limitations. Their psychic vulnerability, their dependence on specific organ systems, the potential for gene seed corruption, the ways in which their training can create tactical predictability over time, all of these are known quantities that any sufficiently sophisticated enemy can potentially exploit. The Primarchs, who designed the Space Marine legions, built them to be effective across an enormous range of scenarios, but effectiveness at scale requires some degree of standardization, and standardization means exploitable patterns. Custodians have none of this. The individualized nature of their creation means there is no standard vulnerability to target. Each one is unique. Each one has been shaped by a process that deliberately avoids the kind of template-based weakness that would allow an enemy who understood one Custodian to extrapolate weaknesses in another. They are, by design, unpredictable, and their psycho-indoctrination is so deep and so fundamental that the corrupting influences that have turned entire Space Marine legions to chaos have, in 10,000 years of constant exposure to chaos influence, never compromised a Custodian. Never. The Chaos Gods have been trying for 10 millennia to find a crack in that armor, and they have not found one. That immunity is not something that can be trained into a warrior. It has to be built in from the beginning. There is also the matter of experience. A Space Marine chapter might have warriors who have been fighting for centuries, and those veterans are formidable, but Custodians do not age. A veteran Custodian might have been fighting for 1,000 years or more, accumulating experience at a pace and depth that simply cannot be matched by any warrior who has a natural lifespan, however extended. 10,000 years of the most dangerous assignment in the Imperium, defending the Emperor's palace against everything the universe has sent against it, has produced a core of warriors whose institutional memory and collective experience in the most extreme forms of combat is essentially without peer. Consider what 1,000 years of active service in the Custodians actually means in terms of experience accumulated. A Space Marine veteran of 200 years is considered ancient and battle-hardened in a way that younger warriors defer to. Their experience spans dozens of major campaigns, hundreds of smaller engagements, and a comprehensive understanding of the full range of enemies that Space Marines typically encounter. That is the experience of a young Custodian. A Custodian who has been serving for 500 years has fought through more varied, more extreme, and more threatening situations than almost any Space Marine in history. A Custodian who has been fighting for 1,000 years or more is, in terms of accumulated tactical and strategic wisdom, something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the Imperium. And they carry that experience not just in their trained instincts, but in their literally enhanced memories. The augmented cognitive capabilities that are part of what makes a Custodian what they are include a memory that does not fade the way human memory does. They can recall specific engagements from centuries past with the same clarity as recent ones. They can review a tactical situation and cross-reference it against hundreds of similar situations drawn from their own direct experience, not from training simulations or theoretical studies, but from moments they were physically present for, wounds they actually received, enemies they actually killed. This living library of experience makes each veteran custodian a tactical resource of extraordinary value, and it is one of the reasons that the death of a custodian is treated as a loss that goes far beyond the loss of their physical capability. The comparison is not meant to diminish Space Marines. They are extraordinary beings who represent the pinnacle of what a template-based enhancement process can achieve. The Imperium depends on them in a way it does not depend on the Custodians, because the Custodians are simply too few in number and too precious to be deployed the way Space Marines are. But when the question is which type of warrior is individually more powerful, the lore is not ambiguous. The Golden Ones win. There is one specific and revealing piece of lore that speaks to this directly, though it is sometimes overlooked in discussions of Custodian versus Space Marine power. When Space Marines encounter Custodians in the 41st millennium, the reaction from the Space Marines is not one of peers meeting peers. It is closer to the reaction that ordinary humans have when they encounter Space Marines for the first time. A visceral, biological acknowledgement of standing before something operating on a higher level. Space Marines, who have been conditioned against fear to degrees that render most threats psychologically negligible, feel something in the presence of Custodians that the lore variously describes as awe, unease, and an involuntary physical response that the Custodians do not even intend to induce. That aura, that quality of presence that causes even enhanced transhuman warriors to register the proximity of something above them on the scale of power, is not theater. It is the Emperor's divinity, encoded into the cellular biology of the 10,000, expressing itself through every interaction they have with the world. Part 5. Dress to Kill. The war gear of the 10,000, imagine spending a small planet's annual gross output on a single suit of armor, then filling it with one of the most lethal beings in the known galaxy. That, roughly speaking, is what a Custodian looks like when fully equipped, and the weapons they carry are at least as extraordinary as the armor. Let us start with the armor itself, because it deserves more attention than it typically gets. Standard Space Marine power armor is constructed primarily from ceramite, a heat-resistant synthetic ceramic composite that forms the plates of the armor's outer shell. This material is excellent. It stops bolter rounds. It resists significant plasma exposure. It has been refined over 10,000 years of use into the most thoroughly tested military armor in the Imperium's history. It is not, however, what the Custodians wear. Custodian armor is built from auramite, and auramite is something else entirely. The Warhammer 40,000 fandom wiki describes auramite as a material of unknown provenance and extraordinary resilience. Its natural color is a shining gold, appropriate for the Emperor's personal guard, though through alchemical processes that are closely guarded secrets, it can be tinted or modified in color on a molecular level. The physical properties that make it remarkable are not simply its structural hardness, though that is substantial. Auramite is described as nigh impenetrable in the lexiconum, placing it in a category of durability that goes significantly beyond ceramite's capabilities. But auramite has a property that goes beyond simple physical protection that makes it uniquely suited to those who wear it. At a quantum level, auramite is almost completely inert. In practical terms, this means it does not impede the manipulation of etheric energy the way other protective materials do. Psychic power, which is drawn from the warp, flows through and around auramite far more freely than it does through ceramite. The implications of this are profound. The Emperor himself wore auramite during the Siege of Terra, not because he needed its physical protection in the conventional sense, but because his plans required him to be sitting on the Golden Throne, directing enormous psychic power against demonic incursions through the webway. Standard ceramite armor would have interfered with those energies in ways that could have been catastrophic. Auramite let the energy move as it needed to. For a Custodian, whose enhanced biology already carries something of the Emperor's divine spark, wearing auramite is not just protective. It is in some sense complementary to their nature in ways that ceramite could not be. The lore suggests that the connection between a Custodian and their armor goes beyond the purely physical, that each suit, custom-made for its specific wearer, in a process that takes years and involves generations of dedicated armorer families trained in ancient secret techniques that they share with no one outside their line, is not merely fitted but attuned. Each suit is unique, not just fitted differently, but unique in its specifics, in the exact arrangement of its sensor arrays, in the precise calibration of its refraction field generators, in the specific layout of its proximity sensor systems. No two custodian armor suits are alike. Each is made for one warrior and one warrior only. This is, from a purely logistical standpoint, spectacularly inefficient. It is also, from the perspective of what the custodians are supposed to be, completely appropriate. The primary weapon of the custodian guard is the guardian's spear, and calling it a spear is a little like calling a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier a boat, technically describing the general category, missing essentially everything important. The guardian spear is a polearm, yes, in the sense that it has a long handle and a bladed head. But the blade is a power weapon, its edge surrounded by a crackling energy field that can cut through Chaos Space Marine armor the way a hot knife moves through wax. And built into the shaft of the weapon is a highly advanced double-barreled bolter. So, at range, the Guardian Spear delivers precision bolter fire. In close combat, it is a devastatingly fast power blade that a being of custodian strength can swing at speeds that challenge the eye to follow. The weapon has been the signature of the Adeptus Custodes since the Unification Wars. It predates the Space Marines. It predates the Great Crusade. In some ways, the Guardian Spear is a symbol of what the Custodians are, a fusion of elegance and lethality, beautiful and deadly in equal measure, designed to work at any range and in any situation, requiring no support systems beyond the warrior who carries it. The Misericordia deserves mention as well, because it is fascinating in a way that goes beyond pure martial function. The Misericordia is a ceremonial dagger, carried by every custodian as a symbol of their office as much as a weapon. The name itself is Latin for mercy, or act of mercy. In medieval usage, a misericord was a dagger used to deliver the killing blow to a fallen enemy whose armor could not be penetrated by a sword, finishing them quickly. The custodians carry this weapon not as a backup sidearm in the conventional sense, but as a statement about what they are. They are the Emperor's mercy and the Emperor's judgment made manifest. They deliver death swiftly as a mercy to everything that stands against them. The Alaris pattern Terminator armor worn by the specialized Alaris custodians is another step beyond even standard custodian plate. Already positioned far above Space Marine Terminator armor, the Alaris pattern incorporates all of standard custodian plate's properties: the auramite construction, the proximity sensors, the refraction field generators, while adding the additional mass and protection of Terminator-grade reinforcement. Alaris custodians can teleport directly into combat using integrated deep strike capabilities, appearing in the middle of enemy formations and wreaking havoc before any effective response can be organized. The Virtus Praetors mount Dawn Eagle jet bikes, which are sleek and extraordinarily fast aerial combat platforms that allow custodians to project their lethality across much greater distances and react to threats across the full breadth of any engagement. A Virtus Praetor arrives like a golden lightning bolt, fast enough to be past most defensive fire before a gunner can fully track them, hits with the force of several tons of armor and enhanced biology, moving at significant speed, and is gone before the enemy can respond effectively. There is also the Castellan Axe, the preferred weapon of the Alaris Terminators, which deserves a moment of attention because it represents something important about the Custodian's tactical philosophy. The Castellan Axe is enormous, a two-handed power weapon of such mass and edge that it can cleave through the armored hull of a light vehicle as readily as it cuts through any personal armor. The Alaris Custodians, already wearing the heaviest pattern of custodian armor and teleporting directly into enemy formations, carry these weapons specifically for the task of tearing apart the defensive structures that enemies try to create. Bunkers, barricades, reinforced doors, the physical infrastructure of an enemy's defensive position. The Alaris go directly for these targets, dismantling them with an efficiency that opens the way for the rest of the shield host to advance. The Storm Shield, carried by some Custodian Guard configurations, is another element that speaks to the layered defensive philosophy the Custodians bring to their equipment selection. A Storm Shield generates a powerful energy field that deflects even anti-tank weapons, providing the carrier with a degree of protection that, in combination with their auramite plate and the natural resilience of their enhanced biology, creates something that borders on functionally unkillable in conventional combat terms. A Custodian Guard, carrying a Sentinel Blade and a Storm Shield, can advance through weapon fire that would reduce a Space Marine to components, reach their target's throat, and do what they came to do with the calm precision of someone who was never in genuine danger. The vexilla, the sacred standards carried by vexillous praetors, are not decorative. In the lore, the standards of the Custodians carry something of the same holy light that the Custodians themselves generate, a physical representation of the Emperor's authority and purpose that provides measurable enhancement to the warriors fighting beneath them. The symbolic and the practical are not separate things in the culture of the Custodians. Their symbols are their substance. The war gear of the Custodians reflects the philosophy of their existence. Nothing is standard, nothing is mass-produced. Everything is made with complete dedication to its specific purpose and its specific user. The resources required to outfit a single Custodian would outfit 100 Space Marines. No one in the Imperium, except perhaps the Emperor himself before he sat down on the Golden Throne, would consider this anything other than completely appropriate. Part 6. The War Within the Webway. There is a war in Warhammer 40,000 lore that most people never fully appreciate, partly because it happened largely in secret, and partly because its scale and horror are so vast that they are difficult to convey. The War Within the Webway. The hidden war that claimed more Custodian lives than almost any other conflict in their history. The war that the Emperor himself fought at the cost of everything else, including ultimately his physical freedom. To understand it, you need to understand the Golden Throne and its original purpose. The Custodians are known to guard the Emperor on his Golden Throne, which in the 41st millennium is a life support device and psychic amplifier that keeps the Emperor's shattered body alive and powers the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that makes faster-than-light travel possible for Imperial shipping. But the Golden Throne was not built for this purpose. That is not what it was designed to do. The Golden Throne was built as an access point to the Webway. The Webway is a network of tunnels through a dimension that exists between real space and the warp, constructed millions of years ago by a species so ancient that humanity had barely developed language when they existed. The Eldar use it extensively. It allows them to travel across the galaxy without exposure to either the dangers of real space or the horrors of the warp. The Emperor, who had been planning the survival and eventual transcendence of humanity for longer than most civilizations have existed, understood that if humanity could access the Webway, it would solve one of the species' most fundamental vulnerabilities. Travel through the warp is necessary for communication and transportation across an empire of millions of worlds, but it exposes human souls to corruption and danger every single time. A human-controlled Webway would change everything. It would allow the Imperium to function without the terrible psychic toll that warp travel exacts. The Emperor had been secretly working on opening a human branch of the Webway, tunneling into its structure from beneath the Imperial Palace, for years. He had not told anyone about this project, not even most of the Custodians. The work was his alone, requiring his constant personal direction and the application of his full psychic attention. And it was going well, right up until the moment it catastrophically was not. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, was a psyker of extraordinary power. He was also, in the period leading up to the Horus Heresy, in possession of information that he believed the Emperor needed to know urgently, information about Horus's corruption. Magnus, desperate to warn his father, made a decision that he thought was worth the risk. He tore through the psychic wards of the Imperial Palace with a sorceress sending, trying to deliver his warning through the most direct channel available to him. The wards he tore through were not just security precautions. They were also the containment structure holding the Webway project stable. When Magnus ripped through them, he shattered years of delicate work in an instant. The Webway portal deep within the Imperial Palace lost its integrity, and through the breach, the darkness began to flow. Demons, hordes of them. Not a finite force with a defined endpoint, but a tide of creatures drawn from the infinite depths of the warp, pouring through a hole that could not be simply sealed by conventional military force. The Emperor was left with no choice. Someone had to hold the breach. Someone had to stand in those tunnels and prevent the demonic tide from reaching Terra's surface. And there was only one force he trusted with the task: the Custodians, supported by the Sisters of Silence, the Null Maidens whose utter absence of psychic presence acted as a natural barrier to demonic influence. What followed was one of the most brutal and least known engagements in the entire history of the Warhammer setting. The Custodians and Sisters of Silence fought in the Webway for years, not days, not weeks, Years of continuous combat against an enemy that could not be destroyed in any final sense, only held back, pushed down, contained. The webway itself was a nightmare environment. Strange geometries, pockets of altered physics, tunnels that seemed to shift and reconfigure, and everywhere the pressure of the warp, pushing through the damaged walls of the labyrinth dimension like water through a cracked dam. In the novel Master of Mankind by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, which is the primary source for this conflict, the scale of the custodian losses is made explicit. The Lexicanum records that the 10,000, after approximately 5 years of continuous fighting in the webway, had been reduced by 90%, 90. That means that out of the original 10,000 custodians who entered that conflict, roughly 9,000 were dead by the time the fighting was over, killed by demonic forces in tunnels that no one outside the Imperial Palace even knew existed. This is the context that matters for understanding the custodians' power. These were not ordinary soldiers being ground down by a numerically superior enemy. These were beings of extraordinary individual capability, individually worth dozens or hundreds of conventional warriors, armed with the best war gear in the Imperium, supported by sisters whose very existence was anathema to demonic entities. And they died in their thousands in those tunnels. The enemy they faced was not merely powerful, it was infinite. It was drawn from the raw substance of the warp, where individual entities could be destroyed, but the tide they were part of could not be stopped, only pushed back and held. 2 of the 3 commanding custodian tribunes were killed. The officer who ended up commanding the Imperial forces in the webway for much of the war was a tribune named Ra-Endymion, a figure whose stoicism and tactical brilliance under impossible circumstances represents some of the most compelling character writing in the Horus Heresy book series. He did not win. Nobody won. They held, at catastrophic cost, until the situation on the surface of Terra became so desperate that the Emperor was finally forced to leave the Golden Throne, briefly, to board Horus's battle barge and confront his fallen son personally. In his absence, Malcador the Sigillite sat on the Golden Throne to keep the webway breach contained, and the effort killed him. The war within the webway shows us something about the custodians that no simple power comparison can fully capture. Yes, they are more capable individual warriors than Space Marines. Yes, they are armed and armored with war gear that surpasses anything else the Imperium produces. But they are still mortal, still finite, still capable of dying in numbers that matter. Their power is extraordinary, but it is not infinite. And the Warhammer 40,000 universe is a place that cheerfully exceeds whatever limit you try to set. The custodians are not unbeatable. They are just, as a matter of consistent record, the closest thing to it that humanity has ever produced. But the Webway War is also, in its own terrible way, a testament to their capability. 9,000 custodians died in those tunnels, yes. But the Imperial position in the Webway held for years against a demonic tide drawn from the infinite depths of the warp. A lesser force would have been swept away in days or weeks. The breach in the palace walls would have become a flood, and Terra would have been overrun from within. The fact that the situation was contained at all, that the Custodians and Sisters of Silence were able to maintain any coherent defensive line against the concentrated power of the warp for as long as they did, is in itself a demonstration of what these warriors actually are. The Tribune Ra-Endymion, the figure Aaron Dembski-Bowden places at the center of Master of Mankind as the last commanding officer of the Webway defense, represents something important about the Custodian's character in extremis. He was given an impossible task. He lost his 2 fellow tribunes. He watched the Custodian force erode from 10,000 to roughly 1,000 over years of grinding combat. And he kept fighting. He kept the lines organized. He kept the demonic advance from reaching the breach while the Emperor sat on the throne and held the situation stable from the other side. He did not break, did not falter, did not reach for some compromise that would have saved lives in the short term at the cost of everything in the long term. He held because holding was the mission, and the mission was what existed. This is the quality that makes the Custodians remarkable beyond the raw metrics of their strength and speed and resilience. They do not stop. They do not fold. They do not look for the tolerable defeat when the perfect outcome is no longer achievable. They fight until they cannot fight anymore, and they fight with the specific precision that the situation requires, rather than the mindless aggression that emotional response to desperate circumstances might suggest. Even in the worst moments of the Webway War, the defensive lines the Custodians maintained were methodical, intelligent, and calibrated to extract maximum cost from the demonic advance, while preserving as much Custodian capability as possible for the next inevitable assault. The Webway War is also the event that most clearly demonstrates the relationship between the Custodians and the Emperor in a way that goes beyond the formal description of a bodyguard serving their principal. The Emperor chose the Custodians for this task specifically, not the Space Marine Legions, which were the largest military force in human history at the time, not the Primarchs, who individually might have matched a Custodian in raw power. The Custodians and the Sisters of Silence, operating together in the most hostile environment imaginable, fighting an enemy that was not just physically powerful, but spiritually corrosive, in a way that threatened the soul as much as the body. He chose them because they were the only warriors he trusted completely to do what needed to be done, to hold a line that could not be allowed to break, without hesitation and without the corruption that would eventually claim anyone whose soul was not as fundamentally protected as theirs. They lost 9,000 warriors. The Emperor lost the ability to act freely in the galaxy for the rest of his existence. The Webway Project died. The bright future it had represented for humanity, a way to travel the stars without the constant psychic peril of warp transit, died with it. The cost was total, and the Custodians paid it, because that was what the mission demanded. Part 7. The Siege of Terra and the Long Vigil. The Siege of Terra is the culmination of the Horus Heresy, the event that defines the entire shape of Warhammer 40,000's dark future. Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's most beloved son and the greatest of the Primarchs, had been corrupted by the powers of chaos. He had led half of the Space Marine Legions in open rebellion against the Imperium. World after world had fallen. Legion after legion had turned. And now, finally, Horus had brought his fleet to Terra itself, to the birth world, to the very palace where the Emperor sat. The siege was one of the most devastating military events in human history. The traitor forces, including the forces of the War Master and some of the most powerful chaos-corrupted Space Marine legions in existence, hammered at the defenses of the Imperial Palace for weeks. The outer walls fell. The inner defenses were breached in places. Fighting reached deep into corridors and halls that had never known battle before. The casualties on both sides were enormous. The Custodians fought throughout the siege with everything they had. They stood at the critical points. They held lines that should not have held. When the defenses of the Lionsgate spaceport were threatened in ways that could have ended the entire defense, Custodians were there to stabilize the situation. They fought in formations that maximized their individual superiority, shield hosts moving through corridors with a precision and discipline that turned narrow defensive positions into killing grounds for any traitor force foolish enough to advance through them. But the decisive moment of the siege was not something any army could prevent. The Emperor, understanding that the battle could not be won militarily, while Horus remained alive and empowered, made the decision to confront his fallen son personally. He boarded Horus's battle barge, the Vengeful Spirit, with a small group of Custodians, and there, in the final confrontation, he fought Horus in single combat and ultimately destroyed him, but at a cost that undid everything. The Emperor was mortally wounded. His body was shattered beyond any healing that the Custodians' medical resources could address. Rogal Dorn, the Primarch who had led the defense of Terra, made the decision to place the Emperor on the Golden Throne, the device that had been built for the Webway project and now had to serve an entirely different purpose, keeping a shattered God King alive. This moment is the pivot on which all of subsequent Warhammer 40,000 history turns, and for the Custodians, it represented a transformation in their fundamental purpose that has shaped every aspect of their existence for the following 10,000 years. They had failed. That is the way many of the Custodians understood it. Their one purpose, the single thing they existed to do, the reason every element of their creation and training and equipment had been oriented was to protect the Emperor. And the Emperor had been destroyed, not killed, which they might have accepted, but broken, crippled, trapped in a mechanism that kept the shadow of his former self flickering in existence, while his true nature remained perpetually out of reach. After the siege, the Custodians changed their ceremonial colors. Their cloaks, which had been red during the Great Crusade, became black. This was not a stylistic choice. It was a statement of mourning that they intended to maintain until the Emperor rose from the throne, or until they themselves were destroyed. Many of the most senior custodians, particularly those in the elite formation known as the Hive Guard, stopped wearing most of their armor entirely, walking in only their black helms, capes, and loincloths, as if the full panoply of a custodian was no longer something they felt entitled to wear. This grief should not be mistaken for inaction. For the next 10,000 years, the custodians continued to stand their watch. They maintained the defenses of the imperial palace with the same absolute diligence they had always applied. They patrolled the corridors and the battlements. They ran their blood games, testing and retesting and closing every potential vulnerability in the defenses. When threats arose that required their intervention, they intervened. The age of apostasy, the war of the beast, the constant background noise of assassination attempts and coup attempts and infiltration attempts that never stopped targeting the heart of the Imperium, all of these things met the custodians' response. But they largely did not leave Terra. For most of those 10,000 years, the custodians existed in a kind of magnificent stasis, present in force on Terra and absent almost everywhere else. The loss of the Webway War had nearly destroyed them as an organization. Rebuilding to their full strength of 10,000 took centuries. And the philosophical weight of their failure, the Emperor's condition, the question of whether they had done enough, whether they should have done more, whether there was something more they could do now, sat over them like a permanent shadow. This period tells us something important about the Custodians, that their power statistics cannot. They are not machines. They feel the weight of what they failed to prevent. The black cloaks and bare torsos of the post-heresy period are not theater. They are the external expression of an internal state that persists across millennia. Beings who live forever carry their regrets forever. When Rabaut Guillemot returned in the early 42nd millennium, the return of a Primarch to active service for the first time in 10,000 years, the Custodians under their then Captain General were already beginning to reassess the terms of their vigil. Guillemot's presence changed the political calculus in ways that gave the Custodians more room to act. And with that room, something in the organization began to shift. The 10,000 years of the Long Vigil are worth dwelling on for a moment, because they are the context in which the modern custodians exist, and the period that shaped everything about how the 41st millennium version of the 10,000 understands themselves. 10,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time. Human civilizations rise and fall in hundreds of years. Even the Imperium, which deliberately cultivates institutional memory and historical continuity with a fervor that borders on obsession, changes enormously across millennia. Languages drift. Practices evolve. The meaning of symbols shifts. The humans who served alongside custodians in M30 would barely recognize the Imperium of M41 as the same institution. The custodians, the immortal ones, the ones who do not age, who carry their memories intact across the centuries, watched all of this. They watched the High Lords of Terra accumulate power in the vacuum left by the Emperor's inability to govern directly. They watched factions form and compete, and sometimes go to war against each other, within the ostensible unity of the Imperium. They watched the age of apostasy, when a psychotic cardinal effectively seized control of the Imperium and used the Fraterus Templar, a private military force of enormous size, to enforce his personal theological vision on the entire human race. They watched the War of the Beast, when an orcish warlord of unprecedented power and intelligence gathered a force so large it threatened to overwhelm even the defenses of Terra itself. They watched the Noctis Eterna, the Great Rift, tear the galaxy in half at the beginning of the 42nd millennium. Through all of it, they watched and they guarded and they did not leave. The weight of that vigil is something the lore treats with genuine gravity. The custodians who had been adults during the Great Crusade, who had known the Emperor as a living, breathing, speaking presence rather than a distant psychic flame in a shattered body, carried the memory of what had been lost every day of those 10,000 years. They had made themselves into perfect instruments of a purpose that the being they served could no longer directly guide them in. They had continued, because continuing was the mission, and the mission did not end. Some of them sought the death that continued service denied them. The lore mentions custodians who pursued final deployments against impossible odds, not with suicidal recklessness, but with a kind of deliberate offering of their remaining capability to one final act of complete service. They are not remembered as failures. They are remembered as warriors who gave everything, who chose the moment of their ending and ensured it cost the Emperor's enemies dearly. The philosophical tradition that developed among the Custodians over those 10,000 years reflects this weight. The blood games became not just security tests, but meditations on the nature of their duty. The ceremonial aspects of their existence, the rituals of armor donning and weapon war, and the specific prayers spoken over the Golden Throne at prescribed hours were not empty forms, but living arguments against despair. They were ways of saying, every day, that the vigil continued and the purpose had not been forgotten, and the Emperor would be guarded as long as one Custodian still drew breath. The Black Cloaks were their own ongoing argument with themselves, a way of maintaining the awareness of failure that they believed necessary to ensure it was never repeated. Some of their number found these cloaks increasingly difficult to wear as the centuries accumulated, not because the grief had faded, but because there was a question worth asking about whether endless penance served the Emperor better than renewed active purpose. It was an argument the Custodians had been having with themselves in various forms for most of those 10,000 years, and the arrival of Trajan Valorous as Captain General was in some sense the moment when one side of that argument definitively won. Part 8. Constantine Valdor, the first and the greatest. There is a name that appears at the very beginning of Custodian history and echoes through everything that follows, the way the first note of a piece of music determines its key. Constantine Valdor, Captain General of the Legio Custodes, the first of the 10,000, the Emperor's Spear. His origins are, appropriately for a figure of such mythological weight, wrapped in mystery. According to one source, his original parents were killed by the Emperor, who moved entire armies across continents to locate and retrieve him, suggesting that the Emperor recognized in Valdor something exceptional, even before the processes of Custodian creation had done their work. Valdor himself, the lore notes, does not clearly remember whether he was truly the first Custodian ever made, or simply the first successfully produced one, which is itself revealing, suggesting that the creation process had failures before it had successes, and that the being who emerged from that process has been around long enough that the memories of its earliest days have grown uncertain. What the lore is unambiguous about is the quality of the warrior Valdor became. He is described as a warrior of superlative skill whose prowess was exceeded only by the Primarchs themselves. In combat, it was said that Valdor could match even a Primarch in single combat. Let that sink in for a moment. The Primarchs were the Emperor's demigod sons, beings of supernatural physical capability and centuries of combat experience who could face entire armies. The gap between a Space Marine and a Primarch is vast and well documented. The assertion that Valdor could fight on even terms with beings of that tier places him in a category of individual martial power that goes beyond anything else the Custodians are typically described as achieving. His role exceeded pure combat. By the time the Great Crusade was underway, Valdor had accumulated so many names and titles and honorifics in recognition of his deeds that before the Horus Heresy, his pre-earned designations numbered 1,932. 1,932 documented acts or achievements significant enough to earn a warrior a name. By the 41st millennium, a book attempting to record his full accumulated name takes up an entire volume. He served on the War Council alongside Malcador the Sigillite, Rogal Dorn, and others during the crisis of the Horus Heresy. He held a rank that, in the formal structure of imperial authority, placed him above even a Primarch in terms of his relationship to the Emperor. While Valdor's direct military authority was more limited than a legion Primarch's commanding hundreds of thousands of warriors, his proximity to the Emperor and the nature of his charge gave him a different kind of power, the authority of complete trust. Valdor knew the Emperor's plans. Not fully, perhaps no single being could fully comprehend what the Emperor was attempting to accomplish across the spans of time his ambitions encompassed, but more fully than almost anyone else. He was one of the very few beings who understood not just what the Emperor commanded, but why. He was present at the highest level discussions about the fate of the Imperium. He received orders that other commanders, even Primarchs, were not told about. He was the keeper of secrets that the rest of the Imperium simply did not know existed. His final fate is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the setting. After the Horus Heresy, after he had returned with the broken Emperor's body to Terra and helped oversee the installation of the Emperor on the Golden Throne, Constantine Valdor disappears from the records, not killed in battle, not retired to some ceremonial role, simply gone. His successor as Captain General was given the role, and Valdor is not mentioned again in any subsequent source with any certainty. Where did he go? The theories are various, and none of them are confirmed by official lore. Some suggest he undertook a mission of such sensitivity that all records were deliberately expunged. Some suggest he sought death in some final act of service that is not documented. Some suggest he is still alive somewhere, pursuing some goal that even the custodians of the 41st millennium are not told about. The official position of the lore is silence, which in Warhammer 40,000 is often the loudest statement of all. There is something profoundly fitting about Valdor's disappearance, given what he represents. He was the one being in the entire Imperium who had been closest to the Emperor from the very beginning, who had participated in the most significant and most secret moments of the Emperor's great project, who had accumulated knowledge so comprehensive and so sensitive that it could reshape how the entire Imperium understood its history and its purpose. A being with that knowledge and that capability, freed from the formal constraints of the Captain General's role, would be one of the most dangerous and most powerful individuals in the galaxy, regardless of what he chose to do with himself. The fact that he is simply not there to be questioned or examined or potentially manipulated by any of the Imperium's many factions is either a tragedy or exactly the outcome Valdor intended. Perhaps both. His legacy continues in ways that are more tangible than mystery. The Valdor Tank Hunter, a formidable armored vehicle used by some Imperial forces, bears his name. The tradition of the Blood Games, which he is credited with helping to establish, continues every year. The standard of individual excellence that he set, the benchmark against which all subsequent Captain Generals have been measured, is still the reference point against which the Custodians evaluate what their leadership should aspire to be. In a culture that does not particularly celebrate its heroes in the chest-thumping way that some other Imperial institutions do, the fact that Valdor's name and standard remain central to Custodian self-understanding, a full 10,000 years after his disappearance, speaks to the depth of the impression he left. What his life represents, in the broader context of this discussion, is the highest expression of what a custodian can be, not just in terms of combat power, though that was extraordinary. In terms of the combination of martial brilliance, strategic intelligence, absolute incorruptibility, and personal dedication to a single purpose that defined his existence. He was exactly what the Emperor intended to create when he designed the process that would make the 10,000. In Valdor, that intention was achieved in its most complete form. Part 9. Trajan Valoris and the Modern Custodes. The 41st millennium is not kind to any institution that has been running for 10,000 years, and the Custodians are not immune to the grinding weight of that much time. The Imperium they guard is a fractured, desperate thing compared to the bright ambition of the Great Crusade era. The Emperor has not spoken a clear word in 10,000 years. The High Lords of Terra often pursue agendas that have more to do with factional politics than with genuine service to humanity. The threats pressing against the palace walls come not just from the obvious enemies outside, but from the corruption and incompetence within. Into this environment came Trajan Valoris, and he changed things. His rise to the position of Captain General is itself notable. He served initially as an Alaris custodian, one of the Terminator armored specialists who deploy via teleportation into the most dangerous situations. His early career is documented with the kind of detail that custodian records rarely provide, perhaps because his achievements were simply too significant to summarize. He destroyed the Space Hulk called the Mournful Siren. He defeated a Genestealer cult called the Emperor's Writhing Shadow. He led a preemptive strike against an orcish force of warlike tide-level proportions before it could reach Imperial systems. For these and other feats, he was accepted into the Companions, the 300 custodians who never leave the Emperor's immediate presence, for 22 years. But even the Companions was not enough for him. He requested reassignment. In an organization that values its traditions and hierarchies, this was remarkable. He did not want to stand still. He wanted to act. He was elevated to Shield Captain and spent several centuries leading sorties throughout the Sol system and beyond. Then, Andros Launchadre, the previous Captain General, died during what the records call the Years of Madness, and Valoris was elevated to the highest position. The singular achievement that stands above all others in his personal record is his performance in the Blood Games. As discussed earlier, successfully completing a blood game once is significant. Trajan Valoris has completed it twice. No one else in the history of the Custodians has achieved this. He holds a record that has stood unchallenged since he set it. For an organization full of beings who have been alive for centuries or millennia, who have been practicing and testing and refining their skills for longer than most human civilizations have existed, this is a statement of quality that is difficult to overstate. The lore's formal descriptor for him is striking in its directness. Many consider Trajan Valoris to be the greatest warrior to hold the title of Captain General since the Emperor himself walked the stars. That is a short list of predecessors. The only other name on it, really, is Constantin Valdor. And Valdor was considered capable of matching Primarchs in single combat. As Captain General, Valoris holds the position of one of the most powerful military commanders in the entire Imperium. The office of Captain General confers full responsibility for the defense of the Sol System, of Terra, of the Imperial Palace, and ultimately of the Golden Throne and the Emperor himself. When the Imperium faces its most extreme crises, the Captain General's authority extends to operational control over forces beyond the Custodians themselves. But Valoris' most lasting impact on the Custodians may be the shift in their fundamental posture. For 10,000 years, the Custodians had remained on Terra, a potent force deliberately withheld from the galaxy at large, consumed by their vigil and their grief. Valoris changed this. Under his leadership, the Custodians began deploying in ways that had not been seen since before the Horus Heresy. Long-hidden cults in the Terran underhives were purged. 32 separate extrasolar interdiction strikes were launched against threats before they could reach the Sol System. The defenses of the stable warp routes into the Sol System were strengthened in ways that previous Captain Generals had left unaddressed. When Robute Guilliman returned and began to reshape the Imperium, Valoris was crucial to ensuring the Custodians' relationship with the reborn Primarch was productive rather than adversarial. The political complexity of a Primarch reasserting authority in an Imperium that had been governed by High Lords for 10 millennia was enormous. Valoris navigated it. He led the defense of the Imperial Palace during the Second Battle of Terra against the forces of Khorne. When 4,000 Custodians marched out to defend the palace during that conflict, more than half were lost. Even in victory, the cost was devastating. Valoris, as a character in the Watchers of the Throne novel series, demonstrates qualities that the raw power statistics don't fully capture. He is politically astute in ways that most warriors are not. He understands that defending the Emperor in the 41st millennium means more than guarding a physical location. It means ensuring the political stability of the structures that allow the Imperium to function, because a divided and dysfunctional Imperium is already losing even before any enemy strikes a blow. He is willing to engage with the High Lords of Terra as a participant in governance when circumstances require it, which previous Captain Generals had largely avoided. He also possesses the Moment Shackle, a relic of ancient Terra, whose function the lore describes as allowing its bearer to perceive the near future in ways that go beyond any normal tactical anticipation. It was apparently the Moment Shackle that eluded Valoris to predict Guilliman's return precisely enough to ensure the Custodians were prepared for the changes that return would bring. Valoris is what the Custodians look like when they are fully activated, fully engaged, not sitting behind walls waiting for an enemy to come to them, but reaching out into the galaxy and making their influence felt. He is the proof that the 10,000 were not built only for defense. They were built to be the sharpest instrument in the Emperor's arsenal, capable of any task, deployable against any threat, sufficient to any challenge that a human warrior could conceivably face. What Valoris has done, perhaps more than any Captain General since Valdor, is remind the Custodians of what they were made for. Not the vigil, which was a consequence of failure, not the penance, which was appropriate to a moment, but was never meant to be permanent. The Custodians were made to protect the Emperor's dream as much as the Emperor's body. And the Emperor's dream was not the Imperium as it currently exists, grinding and dysfunctional and burning through billions of lives in the process of its own survival. The dream was the humanity that could exist when the long war was finally won. The Custodians who forget this become mere guards. The Custodians who remember it become something closer to what they were always supposed to be, the vanguard of humanity's future, moving through the darkness with certainty and purpose and the conviction that the golden light they carry forward is worth the cost of carrying it. Part 10. the 10,000 and their castes. To fully understand what the Custodians are capable of as an organization rather than as individuals, it helps to understand how they are structured and what different elements of that structure are designed to do. The Adeptus Custodes is not monolithic. It is a collection of specialized formations, each oriented toward a different aspect of its mission, and together they form a force of remarkable tactical flexibility for their small size. The overall organization is headed by the Captain General, currently Trajan Valoris. Below the Captain General are 2 tribunes, who manage the many ritual and ceremonial functions of the order. Below them are the Shield Captains, who lead the tactical formations called Shield Companies. A Shield Company typically consists of a few squads of Custodian Guard, a Vexillus Praetor who carries the formation's sacred standard, a squad of Virtus Praetors on jet bikes, and a squad of Alaris Terminators, plus whatever vehicles the mission requires. Multiple Shield Companies form a Shield Host when a larger operation demands coordinated action, and Shield Hosts are led by Captain Commanders with a council of Vexillus Praetors providing tactical support. 300 of the Custodians, known as the Companions, form the innermost ring of the Emperor's personal guard, and never leave the immediate vicinity of the Golden Throne. They are the last line of defense, the final barrier, and their existence is defined by a proximity to the Emperor's presence that the lore treats as something between a military assignment and a religious vocation. The main combat castes define the different tactical roles the Custodians fulfill. The Custodian Guard are the standard formation, which in this context means the finest all-round warriors in the Imperium. They carry Guardian Spears or Sentinel Blades with storm shields, and they operate in the measured, precise formations that maximize their individual superiority and minimize unnecessary exposure to massed fire. The Thyranatwi are the Terminator caste, the Alaris Custodians, who are deployed in the most extreme circumstances requiring heavy breaching capability. They wear the Alaris pattern Terminator armor, which is to standard Custodian plate, what a battle tank is to a personal vehicle: larger, heavier, more protective, more destructive, slower in a relative sense, but still faster than almost anything it encounters. The Alaris carry Castellan axes, which are massive power weapons capable of tearing through vehicle armor, and integrated Bane grenade launchers that clear infantry concentrations before the Custodian reaches them. They can also teleport, materializing directly in the middle of enemy formations in a way that eliminates whatever defensive advantages those formations might have established. The Cataphractoi are the jet bike riders, who become the Virtus Praetors when they deploy in the 41st millennium. They operate Dawn Eagle jet bikes, which are exceptionally fast aerial platforms that carry a Custodian at speeds that make them difficult to track and nearly impossible to intercept with anything short of dedicated anti-aircraft systems. The Virtus Praetors provide fast response, rapid exploitation of tactical opportunities, and a hammer capability against targets that might attempt to outmaneuver the infantry Custodians. Their speed also allows them to function as an extended reach for the force, covering threats across a much wider operational area than the foot soldiers can manage alone. The Ephoroi are the most secretive of all the Custodian castes, and in many ways the most fascinating. They are the intelligence and covert operations arm of the Custodians, responsible for counterintelligence, assassination, infiltration, and the kind of work that a force of 7-foot-tall golden warriors in shining auramite armor cannot realistically perform on their own. The Ephoroi operate outside the normal structure of the Custodians, working without the full panoply of their formal war gear, blending into the shadows of the Imperium as effectively as beings of their nature can manage. The Sagittarum Guard represent a less commonly seen but important specialization: ranged fire support. Where most Custodians favor the Guardian Spear's combination of close combat and short-range bolter, the Sagittarum are trained and equipped for devastating long-range fire, filling the role of heavy weapon specialists in a force that otherwise relies on its individual warriors' close-quarters superiority. The Moritoi are the rarest and in some ways the most poignant of the Custodian formations. Those who have been so grievously wounded in battle that their broken bodies could not be healed, but who were too important, too experienced, too valuable to allow to die. They are interred in dreadnoughts, walking war machines that serve the same function for Custodians that they do for Space Marines, though the Custodian dreadnought chassis is significantly more advanced. The Contemptor Achilles and Contemptor Galatis patterns are among the most formidable dreadnought designs in existence. And a Custodian interred within one brings all of their centuries of experience and tactical brilliance to bear through a platform of enormous destructive power. A Contemptor Galatis in particular deserves attention for what it represents as a fighting machine. It is a dreadnought specifically designed for close combat, armed with a massive blade and an integrated shield system of extraordinary protective capability. The Custodian inside is already among the finest close-quarters fighters ever made. The Galatis chassis multiplies their reach, their mass, and their endurance, while preserving the tactical intelligence and the fighting instincts that their centuries of experience have developed. The result is something that can engage enemies that would challenge even a healthy Custodian and emerge with the same outcome. The enemy stops moving, and the Custodian continues on. The Coronis Grav Carrier and the Orion Assault Dropship provide the Custodians with dedicated transport and close air support capabilities. The Ares Gunship is a heavy fire support platform of legendary capability. The Caladius Grav Tank fills the armored warfare role. These vehicles are, like everything else the Custodians use, built to standards that exceed comparable Space Marine vehicles. The Custodians do not use standard rhinos or land raiders. Their vehicles are bespoke, constructed with the same philosophy as their armor: rare materials, unique construction, specific capability rather than standardized flexibility. What all of this adds up to is a force that can operate effectively across a genuinely wide range of tactical situations. The assumption that Custodians can only fight at close quarters, that they are simply brawlers in golden armor, is a misreading of their capabilities. They have range specialists, air support, armored vehicles, teleporting shock troops, fast attack jet bike riders, and the full complement of logistical and operational support needed to project force across extended campaigns. They simply do all of it at a level of individual excellence that no other organization in the Imperium can match. There is also the question of how the Custodians relate to Allied forces when they do deploy in support of broader Imperial operations. They are not easy to work with in the conventional military sense. Their absolute authority within any Imperial chain of command they choose to exercise creates dynamics that can be productive or deeply uncomfortable depending on the circumstances and the personalities involved. Space Marine commanders who find Custodians attached to their operations sometimes report feeling simultaneously supported and scrutinized in ways that are difficult to disentangle. The Custodians are not there to judge the Space Marines, but their presence carries an implicit audit function, a reminder that what is being done will be seen and assessed by beings who answer to the highest authority in the Imperium. And this awareness changes how people behave in ways that are not always comfortable, but are usually useful. Part 11. In Battle. What the Custodians look like when they fight. All of the theory and all of the history and all of the comparative analysis only goes so far. At some point, the only way to understand what the Custodians truly are is to follow them into battle and see what happens. The lore provides enough documented engagements and narrative accounts to paint a picture that is both precise and extraordinary. Picture a Custodian guard advancing through a corridor of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra. The traitor forces have breached the outer walls and are pressing deep into the palace's defensive layers. Bolter fire fills the air. Chaos Space Marines, warriors who are themselves superhuman killing machines, each individually capable of slaughtering dozens of ordinary soldiers, are advancing with the confidence of beings who have fought and won across the entire galaxy. The Custodian does not take cover. There is no need. The bolter rounds that should find the gaps in Auramite plate seem to find slightly different trajectories instead, the Emperor's ward turning fortune aside. The ones that do connect spark against gold and leave no mark worth noting. The Custodian moves through the fire the way water moves through air, continuously, smoothly, at a pace that seems unhurried until you compare it to what should be possible and realize that the being in front of you is covering ground at a rate that challenges calculation. The Guardian Spear comes up. The integrated bolter in the weapon's shaft puts precise rounds into the advancing traitors, each shot placed with the accuracy of a centuries-trained eye that can account for every variable in a firefight simultaneously. The rounds are not intended to kill in most cases. They are intended to create windows, to disrupt formations, to force targets into configurations where the subsequent close combat becomes a guarantee rather than a contest. The traitor's close. The power blade of the Guardian Spear begins its work. A Chaos Space Marine weighing 300 kilograms in full armor is lifted by one arm and thrown through a reinforced bulkhead. The next receives the blade through his chest armor, the power field parting ceramite the way ceramite parts flesh, and is already falling before the Custodian's attention has moved on. The third manages to land a blow with a chain axe that would have gutted a Space Marine, and finds that the Auramite plate distributes the force in ways that turn a wound into an inconvenience. The Custodian's response is the Misericordia, the Mercy Blade, driven through the eyepiece of the traitor's helmet with a precision that reflects not rage, but the simple professional assessment that this particular threat has been addressed. The corridor is cleared. Dozens of enhanced transhuman warriors, each one formidable in their own right, each one a veteran of the long war against the Imperium, reduced to components in the time it takes a Space Marine squad to reload. The Custodian is not breathing hard. The armor is unmarked. The Golden Guardian moves on to the next corridor. This is what the lore describes, across dozens of sources and multiple decades of accumulated setting building. Not a warrior struggling against dangerous foes. Not a superhuman being pushing to the edges of their capability. A craftsperson at work, applying exactly the right amount of force to exactly the right location, achieving the necessary outcome with the minimum necessary expenditure. The Chaos Space Marines in that corridor were not a difficult problem for the Custodian. They were the kind of enemy a Custodian encounters when things are relatively ordinary. The harder fights are illuminating in different ways. The war within the webway showed what happens when the enemy is not constrained by the physics that define normal combat. Demonic entities drawn from pure psychic energy cannot be simply outmatched in the way a physical opponent can. You can cut them apart and they reform. You can drive them back and they return. The Custodian's response to this was to stop thinking about individual engagements and start thinking about the architecture of containment, how to build defensive lines that force the demonic tide to expend itself against prepared positions rather than flowing around them, how to coordinate the Custodian's physical capability with the Sisters of Silence's psychic nullification to create zones where demonic manifestation was suppressed, how to make every tunnel and chamber and abandoned corridor in the webway's labyrinthine geography work for the defense rather than against it. This demonstrates something about the Custodians that their individual combat statistics, however impressive, can obscure. They think, they adapt. They do not have a single preferred tactical approach that an enemy can learn and counter. They analyze the specific problem in front of them and develop the specific solution that problem requires, drawing on their vast accumulated experience and their significant individual intellect to find the approach that will work. This adaptability is as much a part of their power as any physical capability. The engagement at the Echo Vault, mentioned earlier, is another illustration. 40 Alaris Terminators teleporting into the heart of a Black Legion formation is not a particularly subtle approach, but the decision to use 40 Alaris rather than more Custodian Guard, the choice to target the command structure directly rather than engaging the larger force, the timing of the deployment to coincide with a moment when the Black Legion's attention was focused on securing the Echo Vault itself. All of these reflect operational thinking of considerable quality. The Alaris did not just blunder into the enemy lines. They were placed precisely where they needed to be to produce the specific outcome the shield host required: command decapitation, followed by rout of the leaderless formation, followed by the securing of the objective before any coherent response could be organized. There are also the quieter, less dramatic demonstrations of Custodian capability that the lore occasionally records. Shield-capped in conversations with Primarchs. Custodians identified as being the source of strategic advice that changed the course of major campaigns. The political interventions during the Age of Apostasy when the Custodians briefly deployed to help end the reign of Van Dyer. These moments remind us that the 10,000 are not simply a hammer. They are a precision instrument with a full range of settings, capable of addressing threats that range from the most direct and violent to the most subtle and political. The culture that has grown around this capability over 10,000 years is its own kind of extraordinary. The Custodians have developed a martial tradition that is entirely their own, distinct from the traditions of the Space Marine chapters, distinct from the practices of any other military organization in the Imperium. Their weapons have been carried since before the Great Crusade, and the relationship between a custodian and their guardian spear is not simply the relationship of a soldier to their issued equipment. Each weapon is as individual as the warrior who carries it. It carries the weight of the history of its use. It has been present at battles that shape the Imperium. In some cases, the weapon has outlasted multiple custodians, passed from one to the next as a form of institutional memory made physical. The ceremonies that surround the custodian's daily existence are not empty ritual. They are the accumulated practice of 10,000 years of beings who understood that maintaining the quality of your attention, day after day, year after year, across centuries of service requires deliberate structures. The prayers spoken over the Golden Throne, the specific forms of the daily weapon maintenance, the precise choreography of a watch exchange at the most sensitive posts within the palace. Each of these exists because, at some point in the past, someone thought carefully about what was needed to keep a being of extraordinary capability at their absolute best, indefinitely, in conditions of extreme psychological weight, and arrived at these answers. Part 12, just how powerful. The final verdict: we have traveled a long way together through the history and nature of the Adeptus Custodes. From the ancient darkness of the Unification Wars to the desperate tunnels of the Webway, from the catastrophic loss of the Siege of Terra to the quiet grinding discipline of 10,000 years of watchfulness, from the individual genius of Constantine Valdor to the aggressive brilliance of Trajan Valoris, from the philosophy of their creation to the specific detail of the auramite plate that covers their skin. Now it is time to actually answer the question: just how powerful are the custodians? The honest answer requires acknowledging several different registers of power, because the custodians operate at all of them simultaneously, and no single metric captures what they actually are. At the level of individual physical combat, a custodian is among the most capable hand-to-hand fighters the setting has ever produced below the tier of Primarchs. Their strength, speed, reaction time, sensory range, regenerative capability, and tactical intuition combine into a package that routinely defeats opponents who should, by any rational accounting, be competitive. They can fight through wounds that would be immediately fatal to a Space Marine. They can track and respond to threats that other beings cannot perceive. They can use the precognitive capability that some veterans develop, reaching into the near future through what the lore calls the numerology of the near future, to anticipate attacks before they arrive. In a one-on-one engagement, a custodian loses to a Primarch and defeats everything else. At the level of small unit tactics, a shield company of custodians represents a force multiplier that is genuinely difficult to counter with equivalent numbers. The Echo Vault engagement described in the Custodian faction lore demonstrates this clearly. 40 Alarus Terminators teleported into the heart of a Black Legion formation, tore apart their command structure, and eliminated the Chaos Lord and his chosen warriors to the last. The Black Legion, the oldest and most experienced Chaos Space Marine force in existence, was effectively neutralized as an operational unit by 40 Custodians appearing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The engagement was over before an effective response could be organized. At the level of strategic impact, the Custodians operate on a scale that goes beyond what their numbers might suggest. They are not a strategic force in the way that an Imperial Guard army or even a Space Marine chapter is a strategic force. They do not hold territory or advance fronts or garrison positions across multiple star systems. What they do is remove specific problems with absolute certainty. When the Custodians deploy against a target, that target is neutralized. The purity of their capability in the operational sense means that their impact per deployment is consistently near maximum. They do not need to commit force for contingencies or hold reserves for exploitation. They bring exactly what is needed and apply it with complete precision. The numbers that help contextualize their power, while necessarily somewhat approximate, point in a consistent direction. Space Marines are considered approximately equivalent to around 20 Guardsmen in terms of tactical value. Custodians are considered equivalent to multiple Space Marines, with some informal calculations placing a single Custodian in the range of several hundred ordinary soldiers in tactical utility. This is an abstraction, and the specifics depend enormously on circumstances, but it communicates the basic relationship. The Imperium deploys Custodians the way a surgeon deploys a scalpel, sparingly, precisely, and only where no less precise instrument will do. Their war gear reinforces this assessment. The auramite armor that makes them effectively impervious to the weapons fire, that would be lethal to Space Marines, means that the Imperium gets not just the individual combat capability of the Custodian, but that capability deployed for longer, in worse conditions, and with lower casualty rates. The Guardian Spear's combination of ranged and close combat capability means that a Custodian does not have an obvious tactical window of vulnerability between ranges. The Alaris Terminator's teleportation capability means that defenders cannot rely on prepared positions to create standoff distance. The Virtus Praetor's jet bikes mean that the Force can project at speeds that tactical responses cannot anticipate. In every dimension of conventional military analysis, the Custodians have been equipped and organized to minimize their exploitable weaknesses. There is also the question of psychological impact on enemies, which the lore treats as genuinely significant. When an enemy force encounters Custodians, the response is not the same as encountering Space Marines. Space Marines are terrifying, certainly, but they are terrifying in ways that experienced enemies have learned to deal with. They have predictable tactics, known capabilities, and established counters that the galaxy's many foes have developed over 10,000 years of fighting them. Custodians are terrifying in a different way. They are the embodiment of the Emperor's personal wrath, beings who carry the divine spark in their very cells, and the psychological effect of their presence on those who worship the Emperors as a god. Enemies whose faith or morale depends on believing that the Imperium is less divine than it claims, is destabilizing in ways that purely physical capability cannot replicate. There are documented cases of enemy formations breaking and routing, not because the Custodians had inflicted catastrophic casualties, but because the sight of golden warriors advancing without apparent damage through fire, that should have been devastating, was sufficient to break the psychological equilibrium of forces that had been fighting confidently moments before. This is not a universal effect, and a sufficiently disciplined or fanatical enemy may not respond this way. But it is real, and it is part of the full picture of what a Custodian force brings to an engagement. And yet the lore is careful not to make them invincible. The war within the Webway killed 90% of the 10,000. The Second Siege of Terra cost more than half of the 4,000 Custodians who fought in it. They die. They make mistakes. Even Trajan Valoris, the greatest living Custodian, and possibly the finest the organization has produced since Valdor himself, operates in circumstances where the wrong decision or the wrong enemy at the wrong moment could mean the end of that extraordinary career. The Warhammer 40,000 universe is not kind to hubris, and the Custodians, to their credit, seem to understand this about themselves. They do not boast about their capabilities, they prove them. What makes the Custodians ultimately interesting as a concept, beyond the simple question of their power level, is the context of their existence. They are the most powerful individual warriors humanity has ever produced, armed with the finest war gear those warriors have ever carried, devoted with complete certainty to a single purpose, and the subject of that devotion, the Emperor himself, is broken. The most powerful guardian force in human history has been keeping watch for 10,000 years over a body that will not wake, performing a function that was not supposed to last this long, carrying a grief that does not diminish with the passage of centuries. There is something genuinely moving about this, alongside all the golden spectacle and martial glory. The Custodians are not just powerful. They are powerful, and they are grieving, and they are patient, and they have not given up. The black cloaks that they wore for 10,000 years to mark their failure, the bare torsos of the Hetaeron Guard, the blood games that test a security that has already proven sufficient 10,000 times, these things are not performed for show. They are the authentic expression of beings who took a responsibility seriously and feel, still, the weight of the moment when they were not enough. When Valoris finally began leading his golden warriors out from behind the walls of the palace, when the Custodians stopped being purely reactive and started taking the fight outward, this was not just a tactical adjustment, it was a philosophical shift. After 10 millennia of penance, the 10,000 were beginning, slowly and with characteristic deliberateness, to act like what they were made to be. Not guards, but guardians. Not defenders, but protectors. Not static walls, but living shields that move where the Emperor needs them, even if the Emperor cannot speak to say where that is. Think about what it means for a warrior to be biologically immortal in a setting defined by constant, grinding war. A space marine who survives long enough, becomes legendary. Veterans like Dante of the Blood Angels, who has fought for over 1,500 years, are spoken of with reverence across the entire Imperium. They are the exceptions. They are the outstanding survivors of a process that kills most of its participants relatively quickly on the scale of human history. Custodians who have been alive for 1,500 years are not exceptional in any statistical sense. They are simply the ones who have not yet encountered an enemy capable of ending them. And what they have accumulated over those 1,500 years, or 3,000, or 5,000 years of existence, is not something that can be replicated by any program of training or any level of biological enhancement. It is pure, irreplaceable, lived experience of the worst and most extreme situations the galaxy produces. When you put a 10,000-year-old warrior into a suit of auramite plate worth a planet's ransom, hand them a weapon that has been their companion for 700 years, and point them at a target, you are not deploying a soldier. You are deploying a distillation of everything humanity has learned about how to survive the worst things the universe produces, condensed into a single physical form of extraordinary capability, guided by a mind that has had millennia to develop the judgment to use that capability rightly. In the grim darkness of the far future, among all the horrors and all the desperate salvage operations that pass for hope, the Custodians remain. Their armor catches no sunlight in the tunnels of the palace. There is no sun underground, no natural light to fall on gold and make it blaze the way it should. But they carry their own light, that spark of imperial divinity that their creation encoded into every cell, every thought, every motion. They are the final argument against despair, not because they cannot be killed or because they have never failed, but because they have failed and grieved and continued, because they have been reduced to 1/10 of their strength and rebuilt, because they have stood at the worst door in the worst moment and held it. Just how powerful are the Custodians? They are powerful enough to have made 10,000 years of the Imperium's survival possible, one watched gate, one patrolled corridor, one golden throne at a time. They are powerful enough that the most potent forces of chaos have spent 10,000 years plotting against them and have not found the way through. They are powerful enough that a single squad of them teleporting into the command structure of an enemy formation is considered a decisive intervention rather than a significant gamble. But perhaps the truest measure of their power is not in any of those things. It is in the fact that they chose to keep going, that they chose, each one of them, over and over across centuries and millennia, to remain at their post and do what they were made to do, even when the being they were made to serve lay silent and broken and unreachable. They had every reason to falter, and they did not. They had every reason to become purely mechanical, purely procedural, to let the grief hollow them out into the shells of perfect soldiers rather than the golden warriors they were designed to be. And the best of them did not allow that to happen either. The Custodians are powerful because they are extraordinary warriors, but they endure because they are, beneath all the auramite and all the centuries, something more than that. They are loyal. They are devoted. They remember what they are for. And in the darkness of the 41st millennium, where every other certainty has been threatened or corrupted or ground down to rubble, that is perhaps the most remarkable power of all. In a setting defined by inexorable decline, where every institution is crumbling, where every victory is temporary and every triumph turns to ash within a few generations, the Custodians represent something genuinely unusual. A force that has maintained its standard across 10,000 years without fundamental compromise. They have not grown corrupt. They have not grown complacent, despite the surface appearance of 10 millennia spent guarding walls. They have not been subverted or diluted or degraded by the slow entropy that claims everything else in the 41st millennium. They are still, as best as anything in the Imperium can be verified to be, exactly what the Emperor made them. The question of how powerful they are has a final answer that goes beyond physical capability or combat effectiveness. They are powerful enough to have remained themselves, and in a universe that corrodes everything it touches, that is the highest form of power there is. There is your answer. 10,000 years of gold in the dark. 10,000 warriors who were each worth an army, armed with the finest weapons humanity ever made, trained in the most demanding tradition the Imperium ever maintained, standing guard over the last and most important thing there is to guard. They are the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000, the Emperor's shield, and they have never let him fall. If you made it all the way to the end of this, genuinely, thank you. This is exactly the kind of deep dive into lore that I love putting together, and knowing that someone out there is sitting with this universe the same way I do makes every hour of research and writing worth it. If there is a topic you want me to go this deep on next, leave it in the comments below. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It costs you nothing, it means everything to the channel, and there is much more where this came from. For the Emperor, for Terra, for the 10,000.